Meeting of the Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee to order. First item is Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Public comment. Nobody has approached either the clerk or myself. Therefore, we will move on to the approval of the minutes from the December 10th meeting. What are your wishes? Chair Gibbs moves to approve, seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Supervisor Marshall is excused. We have Supervisor Poole and Reynolds on WebEx, and the remainder of the committee is in person. So we'll move on to the update on tax delinquent properties, including potential action regarding properties in last round of the Wisconsin surplus auction that did not sell.
I'll start and then we can have some discussion, but there's a memo in your packet. Rhea from my office put the memo together. I'm not going to go through it in detail, other than the overall quick stats part on it's page 3 of your packet. So from just to refresh everyone's recollection, the committee made a lot of changes and recommendations to the board that were ultimately adopted about how we kind of oversee and administer the tax delinquent taking process. And we were using October of 2024 as kind of the baseline when this committee really started talking about the issue and evaluating what the backlog looked like. So I used that for the calculation of the progress, that we've made up until January of 26. And I think it's been great. The outstanding overall number of tax certificates has been reduced by 64.56%. That is excluding the ones that just came on from January, but 64.56%. The value of those certificates, again, based on how we targeted the properties, we targeted, of course, the oldest, but also looking at the properties that had high values, so slivers. We didn't spend a lot of time on slivers with a $2.25 tax bill. The value of those certificates dropped by 83.65. So we've really made a lot of progress. We envision another batch early this year, certainly in Q1, of about 60 parcels right now. And that, knock on wood, should get us up to a place where we're kind of in maintenance mode apart from slivers. So all that background, a lot of things really have gone well across the board and from a number of departments, whether it's on the front end with oversight and the taking process all the way through once we own it and having facilities do some work to secure it and Kim's office doing work to sell it. Things have gone well. So why are we here today? Your ordinance provides that if at the first attempt to sell bids come in through Wisconsin surplus below that appraised value, we have to reject them. Well, we had 2 that came in below the appraised value. They're the last 2 in the chart on page 4 of the overall packet, and it's the second page of the memo. So we had 1 in Athens and 1 in Wausau. Kim can provide more detail on kind of the conversation she had, but 1 was really close, $12,000 on an appraised value of 13, and the other was a bit larger of a gap, a bid of $5,000 and an appraised value of $10,000. But my understanding is Kim had a conversation with that bidder, who, when the bid closed and he found out it had to be rejected, was very willing to can I just pay the 10 and be done? Sadly, no, that's not how that works. So the question really before you, and I'll see if Brian has a different contemplation of this, but really we need some recommendation on what do we want to do with those values. Do you want to set a value for a new acceptable value that you would take upon a listing? Or you just want us to relist them with the current values and see what happens? But Kim, I don't know, is there anything else you want to offer?
The only other thing I would add is that the Village of Athens specifically, I got a couple calls about, and that property did have deed restrictions, covenants on it. So the questions were, okay, why are the deed restrictions there? And I kind of explained the thinking of why we had talked about putting those on. And then second question was, okay, if I purchase this property, it has these deed restrictions on it, how is Marathon County going to enforce that? And so, of course, we don't really have an enforcement mechanism in place, so they were a little bit skeptical, I think, about purchasing something with those deed restrictions on there. So that's the feedback that I got from a couple different callers about that particular parcel.
Well, my hand wasn't up, but I do have a question, so I'll just ask it. The deed restrictions are prohibiting a short-term rental, and isn't there a permitting process to short-term rental, and wouldn't that be our avenue to enforce?
Depends on the municipality, and I don't believe the Village of Athens has anything in place to restrict that.
But doesn't the health department require short-term rentals to be, I don't know, certified or whatever the terminology is, sorry?
Brian?
Yeah, there are certain aspects of those rental properties, those tourist rooming houses that have to be reviewed and inspected by the health department. In my experience, sometimes there's also zoning restrictions with regards to development of a property to be a tourist rooming house. So could be a double edged sword there. And as far as enforcement, I think it would come down to essentially contract law. And then, if we found out that they were not living up to the deed restriction, being the ones that put the deed restriction on there, we'd be the ones who'd have to take them to court to enforce it.
Rental wasn't the issue. It was the building in a certain.
Kim, I'll call on Kim.
So the conversations that I had weren't necessarily around the short-term rental restriction. It was the time frame to get something built on that parcel.
So again, that's the two-prong thing. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Kim, but both the Athens property and the 738 South Third Ave property in the city of Wausau are both currently vacant. Is that right?
They're both vacant lots, yes.
Oh, sorry. Don't know if that's on me. So it's that other piece. It's not once the structure is erected, that's when the short-term rental prohibition would kick in. It's the building a property within that 2-year time frame for those vacant parcels. We did have the deed restriction, I believe 705 East Thomas. Yes, that actually had a structure on it. So you'll see how the deed restriction, that's why Rhea included it in the chart. See, this is all coming back to me. She included that in the chart because it did have a deed restriction on it, and that parcel did sell above appraisal. But that deed restriction, when the structure is already existing, it simply has the short-term rental prohibition on it. So I guess there are a couple of questions. It's not only do you want to set another value, the other thing you could ask us to do is to remove the not listed with a deed restriction.
So the options are go out for re-advertise it at the current appraised value, modify the value, which could have repercussions in light of the uncertain landscape relative to owing the previous owner money, or modifying again the deed restrictions. So what are your wishes, Chair Gibbs?
So I do have a question on both of those parcels. So, Kim, do we know what the back taxes and costs are that the county has on the Athens property and the 738 South Third Avenue property, as far as our costs in them?
I don't have that right off the top of my head. I can find it.
I guess the reason I'm asking the question, because obviously the county is out. At this point, I shouldn't say out, we are looking for reimbursement for that debt that's been paid by the county. And the difference between that and the fair market value is a potential claim by the prior owner. And so the concern that I've always raised was, is a deed restriction creating a potential reduced value on the potential sale? And at least the cursory review is that those two parcels potentially got some pushback by the potential purchasers because of the deed restrictions. And so don't want to put the county in a position where we potentially are in litigation over the difference, because we now have an appraisal of, for example, on 738 South Third of $10,000. The only bid we had was $5,000, or the high bid that was received during the auction was $5,076. And if our debt is below $5,076, then all of that difference potentially is a claim by the potential previous owner.
Supervisor Lumber.
Just to change the subject maybe, do we have data on, we split some of these and said we were going to analyze the difference between those without the deed restrictions and those with. Do we have that information?
That's what the chart is. The good news,
That's the only
we had a lot of
information.
people pay off and a lot of people repurchase. So those are all of the sales that we have from tax delinquent takings.
And I just processed 2 repurchases in the half hour before this meeting. So there are 2 more that are not on this chart that are now back in the coffers.
I can't do math real quick, but I'm looking at the document we have for 738 South Third Avenue when we had the title research done, and the amount of delinquent real estate taxes in 2015 were $1,646, 2016, $6,300, $3.93, 2017 were $7,000, and that continued through 2022. So a lot more, we are owed a lot more than what you're gonna end up getting based on what I see for the appraisal and high bid for 738 South Third Avenue.
I have a few comments, Mr. Chair, if it's okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I've been a skeptic of the deed restrictions. I think they're basically a solution in search of a problem. I mean, if we see that we're starting to get like out-of-state developers buying this land and they're just sitting on it, I think that's a real problem and that can kick in. But if not, I don't see why they should be listed except with deed restrictions unless there is some specific reason for it. But for these, especially if they've been rejected, I would just get rid of the deed restriction for these and just list them at the market price. Thank you.
I would just like to reiterate the reason we put the deed restrictions in place was out of a concern about affordable housing and trying to address that need in the county. And it was through county board action that we created the authorization to impose those deed restrictions. I would be reticent to just throw out deed restrictions carte blanche, and I would just encourage us to maybe take another stab at trying to get bids on the properties, and at what point can we, if we go out for bids on 2 occasions, after that, can we set our own value? Are there some statutory?
I believe it's after the first attempt to sell, then the county board or a designated committee can make a good faith, I guess is the word I would use, or the term I would use, attempt to sell the property second, third, fourth time, whatever it takes, and you can set what you believe to be the value at that point in time.
Would a compromise be to remove the deed restrictions on the Athens property, keep it on the Wassa property, and re-advertise? In light of the fact that we had somebody willing to pay the,
In Athens, yes, the Wausau property was significant, was it the Wausau one that was significantly lower? Or is that, no, the Wausau one was the one where he was willing to pay the $10,000. That's the South Third Avenue, so we have someone willing to pay that.
Chris?
Thank you, Chair. I think it would be inconsistent to say, well, in this property, because we had something that was close to the appraised value, we're gonna change the deed restriction. But over here, because it was, even though it was close, but the person wasn't willing to pay the appraised value, or you're gonna change that. I mean, your process and your procedure and your policy should be the same. So I understand what Supervisor Poole is expressing. The 24-month to build a house, when you buy a piece of property, a piece of land, there's no restriction typically on how long you need to take to build on that property. So if you have people willing to do that, I understand that we're trying to create affordable housing, and I do agree that we want residential housing as opposed to the short-term rental. Why not just remove the deed restriction as it relates to the 24-month and allow these persons to purchase this property and move forward and be done with this, as opposed to it just expanding and just going on with this kind of government kind of oppression? Thank you.
Any other discussion, or what are the wishes of the committee? What are the wishes of the committee? Options are re-advertise, modify, or revalue. Chair Gibbs.
I'd make a motion to re-advertise the 600 West Village Limits Road property and the 738 South Third Avenue property without the deed restrictions of the owner constructing a residence within 24 hours, or 24 months, excuse me.
I'd like to see the 24-hour rule.
Yeah, well.
Second moved by Chair Gibbs, seconded by Supervisor Poole. Any discussion on that motion, Chair, or Supervisor Hart?
Just a clarifying question, does that mean the deed restriction that the owner's prohibited from utilizing it for short-term rental still stands then?
That's the motion.
Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right, we will move on to claims and question costs, and Sam had sent that out to you earlier. Are there any questions relative to the claims and question cost? If not, what are your wishes? Supervisor Lemmer moves to approve.
Got a question?
Oh, you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Educational presentation, maybe. There's a number of these that have no cost center attached to them, and I'm just curious if you could just talk a little bit about how that impacts, the financial reporting later. Do people ever go back? A lot of them are deposits, so maybe it's inappropriate to have a cost center put there, but.
Yeah, when I pull the question claims and costs, there is some customer transactions that happen in the deposit. They do ultimately end up with a cost center, but it's in a different process, so you don't necessarily see it on here. It's more on a journal entry side. Again, just a byproduct of the report that I pull. But I just want to make sure that all of the transactions are in there.
Just curious, thank you.
Any other questions? If not, what are your wishes? Moved by Chair Gibbs to approve, second by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries. Next, we'll move on to Wisconsin Public Service Natural Gas Regulator Station request along 72nd Avenue in the city of Wausau. Chris?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair. So this, I put together an agenda item memo to sort of flesh out what WPS's inquiry is aiming at. We do have representatives from WPS here as well to help answer questions the committee may have about the nature of the inquiry, what they're up to. The main piece is to try to put a new regulator, a gas regulator station along the 72nd Avenue corridor. So they've been looking at possible locations, and within that search, there are areas that would fit with their planning. And the county, it's on county-owned property. And so the question, and I don't want to get too far ahead of WPS since they're here, but the question is ultimately, as it relates to what they're looking to do, what's the county's or committee's position in terms of potentially selling or leasing or granting an easement to utilize the space for that project. Now, in the packet too, there were a couple photos showing sort of examples of the different types of stations that could go in place. They could probably speak more clearly to the pros and cons of either one, but ultimately those were there to give you a sense of how this is different from a typical easement request, is maybe just looking for a particular strip along a parcel versus a larger area where this station would go in. And ultimately, it's not a specific ask at this point, more of a point of discussion to see where we're at. And then with their information, responding to any questions you have, helping you all come to a conclusion in terms of how you'd like to move forward with it, if you do.
So Chris, do we have discretion relative to the design of the structure or the facility on our property? Is that why the two options are in there? Please, if you could come to the mic, identify yourself and.
My name is Evelyn Weicker. I'm an engineer with Wisconsin Public Service. We certainly would work with whatever, within reason, if you have specifications. We've worked with neighbors before as far as landscaping, what the building looks like, such things as that, if that's what you mean.
So are there questions for Chris or for the representatives from WPS? So the question is perhaps you're not looking for action today, but do any members of the committee have any concerns about potentially granting an easement in this area? Let's deal with it sequentially.
Yeah, and I would say, Mr. Chair, it could be potentially an easement or leasing the land for long-term use, or even potentially a sale of the land, which those two blue squares sort of in the middle of the picture are the ones that are out by the parks property there and the juvenile facility. So those are closer to the road as you turn into those facilities in the park. But I'm not aware of any other use that we're currently having there. So I could see if there's something I'm missing, because I've driven out there many times and seen it's just really along the road there. But I think that's what WPS is looking for, is all the blue squares are effectively trying to get as close to the existing infrastructure along the 72nd Avenue corridor. So among those options were two places that could potentially work for one version of a gas regulator station or another.
And the county's ownership is just in those two, correct?
Correct. The two in the park there, not in the south part there, yeah. One of them is Green Bay Packaging. That's the one further to the east. And then the one further up, I believe, is at the end of Bombardier.
So again, let me ask the question, does anybody have an objection to proceeding with discussions with WPS relative to the location of the facility on county property, whether through acquisition, easement, or long-term lease? I'm not seeing any objection. With that in mind, are there any design criteria that you would like to see put in place at that property as part of those discussions? Are you comfortable with either approach? The fenced in versus the dedicated building with potentially outside apparatus? Chair Gibbs.
I guess just a question. Obviously, if it's an easement, there is no property tax because the county continues to own the property. However, if the property was sold to WPS, would there be any property tax associated with that? If it were sold, would there be any property tax associated with that parcel?
Not the
That's not for
traditional
you.
property tax. We fall under the shared revenue for utilities.
Okay. Sorry.
So there's a payment, but it's based on
It's
the
from the Department of
valuation.
Revenue. Right,
Yeah,
correct.
Yeah.
Ad valorem, whatever. So would you want it buffered, given the fact that we've got a park-like setting in that area? Would there be a desire to have buffering from the neighborhood? Or do we leave that up to administration to try to make the facility consistent with the view of the neighborhood? Supervisor Hart.
And just a question with easement versus selling the property. If there's an easement, would we have more control over what that would look like? And if we sold it, would we have less control over what that would look like?
I'll take my 2 cents. You'd have 100% control on the stuff you still own, which if we're concerned about what it looks like from the park side, put any screening on the park side, but sorry. What's going on with the mics today? But on the easement, we haven't historically put too many controls on those.
It's if you have more than one of these on is when it's, at a time is what it's doing.
So do you have a is there a preference? Is easements versus sale or best interest of the county? Supervisor Lemmer.
I don't know if I have a preference. I guess I'm wondering if the structure is built, does that get counted in our net new construction? Because then I'd vote for the structure.
I would just add, ultimately, any transaction that moves out of the discussion today and any feedback you have would come back to the committee and go back to the board for consideration. If it was an easement, that's a little more straightforward perhaps. I think you see in the picture there's trees along there. My guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, is if you were to say, be okay with selling the property or a lease or having a stipulation being that you would want some sort of buffer between the park area, that you would just stipulate that within the agreement as part of moving it forward. So that would be a part of what we would bring back. So any other thoughts or comments you have along those lines would help to inform what you would see next, should this move forward to the next level of, what it would be contemplated to be.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, I think the preference, since it is in the park area, would be similar to the design that you have on the Ash Street example with shrubbery outlining the property. That would be my preference.
I would say, hopefully we'd be able to put it where we don't have tall trees near it, but that is a concern. If there's any tall trees within a certain
Right.
distance, we might have to cut some of them down because we just don't want to risk them falling on the equipment.
Right. No. And that's why the shrubbery is
Sure.
fine. Yeah.
Are we aware of any restrictions on that property that would limit our ability to sell it?
I'm not aware of it. When looking at the tax parcel, it's all one piece, so it would be essentially, if you sold it, carving that piece out, whatever the parameters look like, and then bringing that back. And that, I mean, I suppose in that transaction too, you could put something in there. One way or the other, you could get the desired sort of outcome baked into that transaction. But as it stands today, I'm not aware of anything after looking at the tax parcel ID myself, but I can certainly double check.
So is it, the direction then would be to proceed with the discussions, sale or easement release would be on the table in trying to protect the view from the neighborhood and see what you can come up with and bring it back? Does that sort of capture the committee's, Supervisor Hart?
And then in all of this, there's a possibility that WPS might go with the two sites that aren't on county property anyway, right? So this is just a discussion of our part of it. It could be completely, this could happen completely with us removed from it.
I will say Green Bay Packaging's already turned us down, and the owner at the end of Bombardier turned us down as well.
So it's looking like us. Was that the direction that you needed?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly works, and I can work with the representatives here to, you know, we can, I'm not sure if WPS has a preference one way or the other, but we could look at the fundamental pieces of what would go in and then provide a couple different options of looking at it in terms of sale. What would it look like if it was an easement? What would it look like if it was a lease? And then bring that decision point back to the committee.
I would just request that we try to minimize the footprint on our property. So that we protect our own future interest in that area as part of that discussion. Is that any other concerns or suggestions or comments? Supervisor Lemmer?
And I would just express an interest in keeping as many trees as possible. So if it could be moved, I mean, it looks like there's trees scattered. So if we could protect the existing, that'd be great too. I don't know if that's possible, but as much as we can.
We can look at that. I mean, it looks like there's, you know, just really next to the road there, if we go a little further down with the station. I don't know if we might have to take some trees out if we try to put a driveway in off of 72nd, or if you'd be comfortable with us doing a shared driveway off of the park access road right there or not. But that's all stuff we can hammer out.
Yeah, we're very, interested in just going into some conversations and see what you guys suggest would be a nice location that we can work together on.
So do both WPS and Chris have enough direction to move forward?
I'm good, Mr. Chair.
Then we'll bring that back at a future date.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
All right, that's through consensus. Next, we'll move on to item 6B1, approving the use of environmental impact funds for wellhead protection efforts from the Environmental Resources Committee.
Is Lori on? Okay,
I am here. Yeah.
all right. Lori, you can take it away. I just want to start with, this is one of the areas where I was a bit perplexed to start. I thought, oh, this is going to be a budget amendment. Want to be very clear, it's not. I'm not sure it needs to go through this committee. It was approved at the Environmental Resources Committee to expend $20,000 for the purpose that Lori is going to so eloquently lay out for you. And the reason it's not technically a budget amendment is because those funds are within the budget, both as a revenue and then a planned expense. Why we thought as staff it was important to come through this committee is that, and this predates me a fair amount, a lot of the environmental impact funds were spent before my time, but the historic practice was that any use of those funds did go through not only environmental resources, but ultimately through the full county board and through this committee. So when in doubt, rest on past practice. That's why it's kind of going through the dog and pony show of quite a number of committees. But Lori can lay out for you kind of what the overall desired use, what wellhead protection is, and what environmental resources recommended. So take it away, Lori.
Thank you, Administrator Leonard. I'm actually going to let my county conservationist, Kirsty Heidenreich, give the explanation of what we would be using the $20,000 for. But for HR Finance, I just wanted to remind you a little bit about the environmental impact funds that those came to us through the construction of that Arrowhead Western transmission line back in the early 2000s. In state statute, it does provide guidance for what types of projects we can use those fees for. And as Administrator Leonard mentioned, historically, we have gone through ERC, HR Finance, and then to County Board with those requests for any of the funds that are still living in the CPZ budget but have not been assigned to a project or a program yet. So for this $20,000 that we're asking for permission to use, I'm going to turn it over to the County Conservationist, Kirsty Heidenreich.
Everyone. Thanks for letting us join in today. Just wanted to give a little bit of a summary on why we are asking for these additional funds. We have found in doing wellhead protection work with so far the Village of Rib Mountain and the Village of Athens, there does tend to be a few barriers in some of the work that we are doing. So we're looking for areas in Marathon County where our rural municipalities have wellhead protection areas that are in cropland production, so row crops like corn and bean rotations. And we're working with them to implement perennial grasses and prairie grasses in hopes that there won't be further inputs of nitrogen into those municipal water systems. And so while we do have some funding sources to connect these municipalities and the landowners that use this cropland, we're finding barriers with things like equipment rental to convert the cropland to perennial grasses, purchase of seed for seeding down these cropland areas. And while these municipalities are kind of carrying the torch and committing to several years of funding to go ahead and oversee this conversion to happen, it's just kind of getting these communities up and going with these wellhead protection efforts and having a source of funds that we can use to set aside and use a little bit for each project so that when we have equipment needs, when we have some needs to supplement the seeding, there is something there that we can do to make sure that we can get these communities going when needed. So hopefully you can take a look at the slides that we presented to the Environmental Resources Committee to get a little bit of a better idea. And I'm also happy to answer any questions you may have as well.
Are there any questions for Supervisor Lemmer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the team for putting this together. It's super exciting. I guess my question is, you're talking about getting started on these prairie grasses. What's the long-term, are there going to be inputs long-term to keep them that way, or is this just a 5-year pilot? How does that work?
Sure. So it's really up to how the agreement is structured that the municipality, takes the lead on. The one example we have in Marathon County of a completed project is with the Village of Athens. And there was an agreement signed between the Village of Athens and the landowner. It was a 5-year agreement in which the landowner, agreed to keep the land in perennial grasses, to not put any type of inputs into the land with commercial fertilizer or manure. And then it's written into that agreement that there's the opportunity to renew in 5 years. So in that situation, I think the village was interested in seeing if the increasing nitrates in their municipal well would indeed start to plateau or decrease. So they kind of did want more of a trial period type of agreement than signing up for some type of perpetual agreement. The one other example we have of a project that is just getting started is with the Village of Rib Mountain. And in that example, we are looking at a 10-year agreement. That one is 10-year because we are trying to utilize a USDA program called CRP, or the Conservation Reserve Program. which allows that land to stay in the agricultural tax assessment to keep the taxes nice and low, and that is a 10-year contract through the USDA. So that contract would likely be a 10-year contract. But ultimately, the agreement is between the municipality and the private landowner that owns the land in the wellhead protection areas. So, while we may provide a little bit of guidance, it really is up to them. The role that our department would play, is kind of overseeing a lot of the upkeep, the operation and maintenance, making sure that that's getting done. And of course, encouraging all parties involved to keep this land use in that area, is something that would ideally be perpetual. One would hope for, for the purpose of water quality. But ultimately, Marathon County stays out of the agreement, and we just serve as more of a facilitator.
So Marathon County's role would be providing seed money only and not on the ongoing operational cost.
Seed money is a great way to describe it, generally speaking. But if you look at your slide deck, you can also see that we provided about a dozen different examples of things that could be used for. It probably would most commonly be used for seed, though.
I use the word seed from the perspective of starting the project.
Right. Understood. Works in both ways here, I suppose.
Other questions for staff? If not, what are your wishes? Supervisor Lemmer?
Are you looking for a motion to move this to the full board?
Okay, we have a motion to approve and recommend to the full board.
I'll look to Brian, not to put you on the spot, but I believe it is going to go to the full board based on the direction from ERC, and one committee can't overrule another. All that said, of course, anytime if a committee wants to weigh in and also recommend, you're more than able to do that as well.
He is correct.
So would the motion be to concur in the recommendation of the ERC? So is that your motion?
Perfect.
All right, we have a motion to concur in the recommendation of the Environmental Resources Committee. Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Now we'll move on to the request to amend the 2026 budget to accept transportation grant funds from the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs from the Health and Human Services Committee. Administrator Leonard.
That'll also be Lori. There's a memo in your packet, short story. The Conservation Planning and Zoning staff worked with the Veterans Service Office to apply for funds through the WVDA, the WDVA, Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs, to supplement 8521 dollars, which are transportation dollars. So essentially getting funds for rides for disabled or elderly vets in the community, and they were awarded the grant. So it's a budget amendment to receive that grant. Lori, what did I miss?
I think that's about it. It was new eligibility guidelines that came out late last year that made us aware that Marathon County can apply for these funds now. So we did put that application in and were awarded just under $3,500. We are currently in our 8521 program, which services elderly and people with disabilities. We do serve about 10 to 15 veterans a year in providing rides to the VA clinic in Rothschild. So we will be using that fund towards helping those veterans either get a reduced or free ride, because even when people are part of our 8521 program, they do pay a small fee to use the service. As part of the discussions we've had with Health and Human Services and the Transportation Coordinating Committee as well, they would like us to do some additional data gathering and research this year to try and get a better handle on the full transportation needs of veterans within our community so that we can identify additional funding sources to perhaps expand in the future with, if funding was available, transportation services that we could offer to veterans. The WDVA funding is specific to providing veterans transportation to the VA clinic at this time.
All right, what are, any other questions? Supervisor Lemmer?
So I chair the ADRC, Aging and Disability Resource Center, and one of the things we really struggle with is getting volunteers to drive. Who does the driving for this? Is this for volunteer drivers, or is there a dedicated staff person? I'm kind of wondering.
So North Central Healthcare does use a combination of paid drivers and volunteers. I think last year, I believe we did bring forward to the full county board a resolution or a letter that we sent to the state regarding volunteers, because since the pandemic, North Central Healthcare has struggled with getting enough volunteer drivers. I believe Jenny has said something like they had close to 30 pre-pandemic and now have more in the realm of 5 to 7 volunteers. But North Central Healthcare does have paid driver staff too, so they use a combination of those to serve transportation needs.
Yeah, thanks. And just as another follow-up, as we get more and more grants through the ADRC, we're discovering the burdens, I'll use the word burden, of the reporting. The staff time, I'm just, again, empathetic to the staff who have to fill out all the reporting. How does that work with the staff load and these grants?
So at this time, we don't anticipate that this would add any significant reporting burdens. We already do report quarterly and annually on the 8521 funds to the DOT department of the state. So we would just be adding a few reporting elements with North Central Healthcare and within our department that we would collect and report.
And again, thank you for applying for the grant. I think it's admirable. So if it's appropriate, I would move to amend the 2026 budget and allow staff to move forward if that's appropriate, or is it more appropriate to concur with the HHS committee?
Hey, is there a second?
Second.
Your motion is second.
To amend the budget, the 2026 budget.
Any other, everybody understands the motion? Any other questions or discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Take us to the JAG Drug Task Force grant from the Sheriff's Department.
There are some memos in that, in the packet as well, reference to each of the grants. I don't know, Sam, if you have any updated information, but we've been awarded one grant. We were hoping to hear on the review determination relative to the second grant by our presentation to public safety yesterday when the sheriff's office presented. I don't believe they've gotten word whether we got the second grant. Public safety took action to recommend amending the budget with respect to both grants. The second contingent upon actually being awarded the grant. But there's a memo for each, beginning, I believe, on page 49 of the packet, relative to the JAG grant with the accompanying budget amendment resolution, and the same is true with respect to the drug trafficking response grant. That one begins on page 52.
Are there any questions relative to the grants? Chair Gibbs.
Administrator Leonard, just one question. So I know there's an application in for the law enforcement drug trafficking grant. Do we know what that application, what the amount is that's been applied for?
The amount that was applied for the law enforcement drug trafficking grant was $22,990. And that is the one that we haven't heard back yet on.
All right, what are the wishes? Chair Hibbs.
Move to,
I'll make a motion that we approve the JAG Drug Task Force grant and the Law Enforcement Drug Trafficking Grant if awarded, and move to the full board for its consideration.
Is there a second? Was that?
second.
Seconded by Supervisor Poole. Any discussion? And we're doing these grants together. If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. We'll now move to 7A, Register of Deeds.
Hi, I just want to mention some highlights in 2025. We finished 2025 with 19,331 documents being recorded, with 81% of those being electronically, and that compares to 78% back in 2024. In January and February, we switched our Land Shark credit card vendor to Authorize.net, which allowed us to keep 100% of convenience fees. In 2025, we collected $11,043.75 in convenience fees and $34,162 in copy fees. I want to thank the county board for adopting the ordinance requiring documents to have parcel identification numbers on them. This provided extremely helpful since land notification allows property owners to create alerts using their PIN numbers. Land notification was upgraded in November, giving the property owners the option of receiving text alerts or email alerts. TriMan was able to migrate the alerts people had set up in the old system to the new system, and we currently have 1,284 alerts set up. The biggest challenge right now with land notification is that people are creating their accounts but not setting up their alerts. I did contact 52 users on Monday regarding creating their alerts and giving them directions on how to complete the process. This week, I did assist 5 people with setting up their accounts and their alerts. I did want to share one email I received from a resident. She goes to say, this free service is so appreciated. I have worried in the past about fraud and unlawful access to my property and home. This has been particularly worrisome with some of the townships and their windmill struggles. I have received numerous requests in the last few years from outside companies and individuals wanting to purchase my land in the town of Wien. This service will help ease that worry. Thank you. The biggest challenge this year was going from 3 people in the office, or from 4 people in the office to 3. During the time, it was Wendy and me, Rob and Steve from CPZ were our saving grace with assisting with indexing. We hired Kelly in November, and she has been a wonderful addition to our office. What does 2026 hold for the Register of Deeds? Right now, we're in the process of getting our condo track index uploaded into Landshark so title companies can easily search and complete their title work online. I'm also excited about the opportunity to help with the sliver properties this year.
Just a quick question relative to the Judicial Privacy Act. How is that going relative to both the requests from the judges and implementation?
It's going wonderful. We have none.
All right, that makes. Okay, any other questions? That's efficiency. All right, thank you for that update. We'll move on to update on Sheriff's Office body camera contract and strategy for addressing funding.
I think we'll give a real short update here. So if you weren't already aware, body cameras with law enforcement are certainly I think they've moved from, this is my characterization, from a want to really a need. It's kind of an expectation in terms of modern policing and modern law enforcement. That said, the cost of those systems are significant. Our vendor that we had, our contract was coming to a close last year, went out for requests for proposals, and our choices were such that we were potentially facing a significant increase in cost. And when I say significant, I'm talking about 300% increase if we were to make a vendor move. So we've changed our approach, working the sheriff's office, I should say, reached out, and we've identified an approach and a strategy to control those costs. We were thinking we were going to need to do a budget amendment within 2025, but we were able to cover those costs because our contract actually ended just in the last month or two of 2025. But Sam was able to do an analysis working with the accounting team within the sheriff's office, and we were able to cover the 2025 costs. Our 2026 strategy, we'll be able to address that at a later date to come in and talk about that. I don't know, Sam, if you have anything you want to add, but right now we're not asking. That's why it's here for education. You should look for something in the near future, but not today.
Correct. My intent is in the near future to bring forth a carry forward to cover the additional amount that's covered in 2026. This contract does cover from November of 2025 through November of 2026. That's why it's split between 2 years. But again, due to the anticipated funds available in the 25 budget, we're looking to potentially carry that over then to cover that overage.
Do we factor in the storage cost in our proposal? I know that there are significant costs associated with storing and processing of the body camera data.
I think that's when we talk about it, it's an expensive undertaking. It's not only the equipment, but you're absolutely right. It's the storage. And as I understand the request for proposals, it's not only just the storage, but at least the premier vendors in the area do a lot relative to assisting with the dissemination of those videos as a function of discovery in any prosecution. There's the obligation on the state of Wisconsin, which our prosecutors are. State employees, there's an obligation on the prosecution to furnish all that information through the discovery process to defense counsel. And the platforms allow a mechanism to do that. But storage, you're absolutely correct, is significant storage cost.
I'm assuming, I just tracking AI, and I know that AI is used in law enforcement to help with that. Have we explored, and are we exploring that as a potential way of inventorying or controlling and cataloging? Where that might come in?
I don't know, Sam, if you want to add. I'll just say you're correct that artificial intelligence is being incorporated into a lot of these services. In fact, some of the services will review the body cam and squad cam footage for you and draft the report for you for review by the law enforcement personnel to approve it. So taking out some of that staff time. Those are all things that can contribute to the cost of the underlying proposal response.
Any other questions for administration? If not, thank you for that update. Presentation on potential highway shop construction funding strategy.
Sure. In your packet near the end, Kristen, can you hear us? This is where we hope Kristen is able to unmute.
Can you hear me? I can hear you.
Perfect. We can hear you now. There's a commercial that started with that, right? That was quite a while ago. So
There was.
Kristen Hansen from PFM, our financial management and advising consultant, is on. One of the tasks we were given was to really look at what are the options before the board in terms of financing any highway shop should the board ultimately approve that relocation. And really that boils down to two options that Kristen will talk through. One is borrowing for what I'll call is the gap. And these are numbers to get the conversation started. We don't have firm numbers for any final project, but if we operate under the assumption that the project itself in terms of construction is $50 million, the board previously designated 30 million of highway reserve. If you think back to that fund balance policy document, and then some action that the board took, you essentially designated $20 million within the highway reserve for purposes of that project. Kristen's going to talk through what the options may look like to, one, borrow for the remaining 20 million and what that looks like in terms of levy impact, what it looks like in terms of overall cost, a couple of interest rate options for you, because I talked about those things during the budget at a high level. And then she's also going to go through option 2 and really a couple of subsets under that of, well, what if instead of borrowing, undertaking additional borrowing, the board approved moving forward with taking advantage of, and that's my characterization, taking advantage of the borrowing the county has already done with respect to the healthcare center building bonds that were taken out in 2018, 19, 20-ish timeframe. And rather than use the revenues from North Central Healthcare to directly service that debt, put that already incurred debt onto debt levy as permitted by law and use the North Central Healthcare funds to limit or mitigate the need for further incurring of debt. So that's at a high level. Sam, did I miss anything in terms of kind of starting the presentation? No? All right, Kristen, I will kind of flip through the slides at your direction. The first slide I have it on already is the county's outstanding debt as of January 1, 2026 slide.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Kristen Hansen, financial advisor at PFM Financial Advisors. Been doing this for more than half my life. So as administration kind of set the stage, back in November, we presented similar information, and now we're going to provide a little bit more details and provide some updated numbers. So this slide basically shows your outstanding debt as of January 1st. You can see that the amount is just over 88 million. Back in November, we were using a number that was about 88.5 million. Most of your debt payments, your principal payments, come due on February 1st, except for the 2 bond issues that are outstanding for the airport. And so after your February 1st payments, the county will have about 82.7 million in outstanding GO debt. The airport bonds are being paid for with a different revenue stream, but they do get calculated into your outstanding debt and your debt limit. So that's why they are included in here, just to provide some context. Page 4 shows where you're sitting with your debt limit. You are currently, as of January 1st, using 9.4% of your debt capacity, leaving almost 91% available. Once the February payments get made, you'll be using 8.8% of your debt capacity, just so you have the context for where you're sitting with your outstanding debt. Page 5, it just shows kind of a history of your equalized value over the last 15 years, which is important because we will be talking about value assumption increases in some of the scenario 2 options. You're very aware of this because you talk about this through your kind of budget process, but your TID-in equalized value over the last 5 years has increased 8.8%, the last 10 years 6.7%, and the last 15 years 4.5%. The TID out numbers are somewhat similar. So you can just see that obviously it changes over time. And so when you're making assumptions going forward, it's helpful to have that context as well. Slide 6 shows your outstanding debt service. the principal and interest payments on the debt. We have excluded the debt service payments for the airport because they're paid for by fees. But you can see what that principal and interest payments are, that total debt service on the outstanding bonds, excluding the CWA bonds. And then we've included just the column for various revenues, sales tax, general fund transfer, and other revenues that the county has been historically using to kind of reduce that debt service amount. So you can see what those look like. The revenues for 2025 and 26 are kind of actuals, and then it's just projections going forward. Obviously, those numbers, if this is the plan going forward, the actual revenues coming from the North County Healthcare, are going to be dependent on what funds you're actually receiving from them, kind of based on the agreement and what funds are available. So you can just see what that net debt service is, what that TID out equalized value is, and what that mill rate is for the existing debt service. Slide 7 shows the graph version, although you're the finance committee, so you like numbers more than the average person. So you can just see, based on the assumptions I just walked through, you can see that your existing net debt service, based on using existing revenues to help reduce that, will be declining over time. Slide 8 just shows the similar trend with the mill rate. So that kind of sets the stage and discussion for assumptions going forward. As Lance indicated, we're looking at 2 different options for kind of addressing the highway building, how to finance it. So slide 10, scenario 1 would be to issue debt to finance the portion of the highway building, making that assumption that the project, just for illustration purposes, is $50 million and applying $30 million from highway reserves. This would assume issuing general obligation promissory notes to finance the remaining portion. This is similar. This is what I said back in November, and that you would continue to use the existing revenues coming in from North Central Healthcare to reduce the existing debt levy. So nothing has changed on this next slide. We show that you need $20 million to kind of finish the construction. You see what the cost of issuance are, similar to like a mortgage. There are closing costs, our fee, bond counsel fee, disclosure counsel fee, rating agency, mini platform is where you post your official statement. And then there's a not to exceed underwriter's discount. Those are specifications that when we bring debt to market, the underwriters get to decide kind of how much they want to offer a discount or premium, as well as the interest rates to kind of, when we do a competitive sale, to find out what's the best deal on that day of sale. So essentially, if you need 20 million, you would have to issue 20,330,000 based on kind of the costs that get factored into that. So the numbers that I'm going to talk about are based on that 20,330,000. Slide 12 shows a kind of debt service assumption, assuming 20-year notes. That's the maximum you can go by state law, state constitution. We are assuming an interest rate of 5%. We don't know where the market's going to go. If you were to sell today, interest rates would be closer to 4%. And at the time that we ran these numbers, we're assuming a 4% growth in value beginning in 2027. So knowing that, I provided the context for what's been happening with your growth in terms of your value. So you can see that we assumed level principal and interest payments over 20 years. Total interest is just under 12 million at that 5% interest rate, and the total debt service for the 20,330,000 is just over 1.6 million on an annual basis. And so if you were to take the existing debt service, that existing net debt service, which is the outstanding debt that you're levying for, less those revenues that you're applying to reduce that, you can see that in those middle columns, and you can see in the far right the net debt service following the issuance of bonds, where you can see what's happening with debt service, the new debt plus the existing debt being reduced by net revenues. And so you can see what's happening with the mill rate. Obviously, it increases. And this is just illustration. If it were the intent of the county board to issue debt to finance the portion of the highway building, there are different ways to structure debt, but this is just for illustration purposes. Next slide just shows what that looks like in terms of your existing debt, which are the blue bars, and the proposed new debt, if the intent was to issue debt, with the yellow bars. So you can see your existing debt will get paid off in 2042 if you were to issue debt. In 2026, 20 years, they would go out further 4 more years. This shows, the next slide, slide 13, shows kind of that similar with the mill rate. A slide disappeared and when I sent it to you. It looks very similar, just so you know. This really illustrates, this next slide, the difference in interest rates, what this means in total interest costs. So assuming the same principal amount, the 20,330,000, using an interest rate of 3%, 4%, 5%, and 6%, recognizing current market is about 4%, 3% and less is what you were seeing on some of the debt you were issuing, for kind of some of your other projects and for the healthcare center. So you can see if you were to get an interest rate of 3%, the total interest with level principal and interest payments would be 6.7 million. 4% is 9.2 million. The 5% is that 11.8, which is the scenario that I showed you, and the 6%, the total interest cost would be over 14.5 million. And so you can see that total debt service column shows that's principal plus interest. And then what that looks like on an annual debt service, all of these being 20-year schedules, that the 3% coupon, you'd see annual debt service of just over 1.3 million. For the 4%, it would be just shy of 1.5 million. The 5% scenario, which I talked about, was just over 1.6 million, and 6% pushes it up to, over 1.7 million. On an annual basis. So this gives you an idea of what those costs would be to your taxpayers if you were to issue debt in current market conditions. The next slide should be the graph, so you can see what has been happening over the last, this goes back to 1995, how the market goes up and down. Now, if you would have talked to me last week about what we think what the feds might do, there was discussion that the feds would probably consider a rate decrease in June and possibly another one in October. And when they do rate decreases, it's usually 25 basis points or 0.25%. Since then, every day is a new day in the market, and with news coming out of Washington, D.C. So, there's kind of concern about that current lawsuit against Chairman Powell. So I do not have a crystal ball, and if I did, it gets blurrier and blurrier every single day. Next slide starts talking about the scenario 2, which would be not to issue any more debt and use the revenues coming in from the healthcare center on an annual basis to help finance the portion of the highway building not being financed with your highway reserves. This would not include any new debt. You would discontinue, kind of phase out the use of the revenues that you are receiving per that agreement with the healthcare center to reduce your existing levy. The county would be then eventually phasing in, so you'd be levying that full amount of the outstanding GO debt, excluding the debt issued for the airport. And then those annual revenues coming in from the healthcare center would be used to pay for the highway building. And then once that happened, it would be available for other capital projects, deferred maintenance and things like that. So scenario 2A assumes a 4% growth in equalized value, which is similar to what we talked about if you were to just issue a new bond issue. So you can see 4% growth in value. We are looking at kind of globally what's happening with all of the pieces of your levy for operating, library, and culvert aid. And we don't have all the columns. We've summarized the columns because it's a lot of numbers. But we're assuming that your operating levy would increase on an annual basis of 1.75%. The library levy increase would be 2%, and that your existing mill rate is 3.4892. Couple of things to talk about. The number of years to fully transition to levying all of the GO debt, including the debt issued for the healthcare center, would be 3 years, assuming this 4% growth in value. And probably another column to look more carefully at is the cumulative funds available for projects. And so if you are looking to finance 20 million of the highway building, it takes just over 5 years to collect that 20 million, and then everything else after that would be available for various capital projects, deferred maintenance, and other needs that the county may have. So basically, the columns on the left, total debt service, the offset, and the existing debt service is what I talked about in your outstanding debt scenario. We've now added your other levies, your operating levies. So you have a total levy column. And so you can see what that total mill rate is. And then there's that phase out of the additional amounts to be levied from the existing debt service to kind of control what's happening with your total mill rate. And Lance, I don't know if you want to talk about anything here.
Perfect.
Kind of this.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. So again, I'll go back before I kind of go forward with what she was just talking about. The top left the small box, again, those are all the assumptions. So the equalized value, why that matters, and I know everybody knows this, so I'm preaching to the choir here, but equalized value, generally speaking, right, is going to drive down the tax rate. So right now we started with the 4% assumption of what equalized value is. All other things being equal, or staying the same, I should say, equalized value is going to push that rate down. The operating levy annual increase that Kristen has there of 1.75, to put that in terms we talk about all the time, that's net new construction. So when we talk about what is our net new construction number, and we all anxiously await the preliminary and then the final from DOR, the assumption that you'll see in that box is 1.75%. So the last couple of years, we've been at 1.68 recently, 1.78, 1.61. A couple of years ago, we were over 2. That was a good year. So that's what that assumption is. Why is library levy increase on there of 2%? Library levy is, again, outside of the operating levy. That's one of those areas that you can exceed the operating levy limit. Same is true for when you look to the bigger chart below, where it says operating, that's the big component of the levy, right? Library is outside the levy limit, the operating levy limit, as is culvert aid. So you'll see the culvert aid assumption that we have going through each of the years is all baked into that. So Kristen put together all those assumptions as you work your way across the chart at the bottom. So what does it mean when Kristen's talking about phasing in or phasing out using the revenue from North Central as the mechanism to service debt. The phase-out plan is to not, would be to not increase the levy. So the phase-out is, it's the flip side of the coin of equalized value. To the extent the levy rate would drop, normally, the assumption we built in here was, how long is it gonna take to phase out the use of the North Central healthcare revenues to service debt? It's gonna be based on the equalized value. You'll see the number of years to transition full North Central healthcare debt onto levy in this scenario is 3 years. In some of the next ones we're gonna go through, if you have a higher equalized value growth rate assumption, the length of time it takes to do that transition goes down. That's because you have more gap in terms of, if you were to hold the levy rate flat, you'd have more funds to transition onto levy. So the initial assumption we operated off of, or the limit on how much we would put onto total levy, was to hold the levy flat. At no point did we want the mill rate essentially to increase. Your overall levy is gonna increase because it's more dollars, but the mill rate was held flat. Does that make sense? Kristen, could I have said that, and Sam, could I have said that more eloquently? Certainly the answer is yes. But that.
Well, and I think, and to highlight your point, you can see that far right column, the total new mill rate. You can see those 3 years, it's kept levy at that 3.4892.
Right, so, oh, sorry, I didn't have my mic on. If you think about that differently, if you would just be adding new borrowing, you had never borrowed before and you had an operating levy that was 50 million, let's say a normal, Marathon County, $60 million of operating levy, and then you needed to borrow for a big building, you know your mill rate is gonna go up because there's no debt falling off. This is different. We're assuming an equalized value growth rate of 4%. And we can talk through any of these assumptions if you want to know kind of why Sam and I, in speaking with Kristen, why we came up with these numbers. But we assumed 4%. That's a pretty conservative number when you go back to the slide that talks about, the last several years. It's been 8 or 9 or 12. But when you go back 15 years, that average is only 4.7% or 4.8%. The last several years, you've seen a lot of equalized value growth. That's a lot of growth in valuation. But it's if you think about more years back from that 10 to 15 year mark, it's much more perhaps on point. Operating levy 1.75, that's more net new construction than you had last year. So that is not a overly conservative number. It's not overly aggressive either. But anything else, Sam, you want to add on kind of those assumptions? What we
I
tried
just
to do?
think on the assumption side, just to bear in mind that TID closure should be happening throughout this timeframe too. Again, increasing the equalized value and how we apportion out the levy, so.
Any questions on that? Otherwise, or anything else you wanted to add, Kristen? Otherwise, you can take the next slide.
I was going to just say that it's a lot of information that, the committee may want to digest, kind of look at it, how the numbers all work together, and then recognize that, there are discussions about, what assumptions do you want to make if this is the route you want to take that you're comfortable with. And if this scenario is a route that you go forward, is that you can revisit these assumptions, on an annual basis. I mean, you're going to want to. So.
Right. Again, I would just say that total mill rate side that on the far right, that was, and say this different, correct me if I'm wrong here, Kristen, but the assumptions of equalized value growth, that drove the first 3 years on the, not the first three, but it's the subsequent three. It's flat, to your point, because that's the amount of time it takes to fully transition the already existing debt onto debt levy while holding
Correct.
the mill rate flat. So
Right.
if, for example, through our annual budget process, if this scenario of transitioning the North Central revenues for purposes of financing the gap for the highway shop is the route you want to go, the board wants to go. If we had a 7% equalized value growth here, you could transition more. You could transition less. Maybe you want to still have not hold the rate flat in that scenario. But this is just, again, to illustrate that high level, this is a high level approach discussion we're starting to have. And we can talk about, Kristen referenced that middle-ish column, cumulative funds available for projects. We'll talk about that at the end as to what that means and what, I'll use the word opportunity, that might mean for the county when you think about your long-term strategic capital planning. But if there aren't any other questions, I'll have Kristen talk about the next slide, which is again the graphical representation of what she just had. Oh, I see a question, Mr. Chair, from Vice Chair Dickinson.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. I like to reiterate, oftentimes in these meetings when we talk about this flat mill rate thing, the mill rate is a multiplier. The mill rate, when it comes to the person's pocketbook, means nothing. It's a way, oftentimes, for us to feel good that we are not raising anything in government, when in essence, all what we're doing is setting ourselves up for some sort of debt payment or future levying. So I appreciate the comments about having a stable mill rate, but again, it's a multiplier. The value of property or net new construction, whatever you want to put here, by a multiplier equals what the taxpayer pays. So when looking at the slides, I'll just throw this out to the committee because I think this is what you're looking at, and what the board will be looking at is, are we going to borrow or are we going to levy to pay for the highway department? That's really what it comes down to, I believe, is the simplest way to put it. Are we going to borrow more, or are we going to levy more out of the taxpayer's pocket? And then in addition to that, are we going to rely upon NCHC to actually make money in the chart? Thank you.
If I can, I think we're saying that I agree with the underlying comment, just to talk about the levying. In either scenario, you levy. But to your point, it's absolutely, you're right, the Vice Chair, if you borrow, that is a course that we certainly can go down. That will get put on the levy. It will get put on debt levy. The thing you're missing, the thing you avoid if you just do the transition to levy is the ancillary closing costs that Kristen referenced and the interest cost. But
And
absolutely.
just to make it clear, debt levy and tax levy, there are different levies, the way you apply them, right? That's what you just said.
The debt levy is a portion of the overall levy.
That's right.
Totally, right.
And so I'll just make this, the final point I'll make and let the committee talk is, there is an assumption within government entities that there will always be debt, that we will always extend debt. And like debt defeasance is one of those things. So the idea of a stable mill rate always presents to the taxpayer, well, we're not really doing much because you're always expected to pay debt. my argument has always been, at some point, can we get off of debt? At some point, can we eliminate that? Can NCHC pay its own bills? It will not. Right? So if we're going to do this, are you going to pay the debt higher up front? Are you going to extend it out? How are you going to balance that out? These are just the basic arguments and the basic conversations within. And I hope the committee would appreciate the thought of what is coming out of the taxpayer's pocket. Thank you.
Chair Gibbs.
I don't disagree. However, I would make one, if you issue debt we've got to make some assumptions. At some point, we either make a decision to move forward with building the highway shop, which we now potentially say that there's a $20 million need. And the need then is either filled one of two ways. We increase the debt levy by issuing additional $20 million worth of debt and cover that over a 20-year period, which effectively costs, with issuance cost, assuming a 5% interest rate, $12 million to the taxpayers. Or we potentially utilize, still the taxpayer is paying the $20 million that's needed for the highway shop, but it is at a lower interest rate than the 5% that is currently there, and we utilize it out of the NCHC payments. So one way costs the taxpayers an additional cost of $12 million. That includes the interest cost and the issuance cost, assuming a 5% interest rate. I don't know what the other cost to get the $20 million. There is a cost there, but it's already baked into the NCHC debt issuance.
I'd like to also just point out that there are variables because while we've committed $30 million of highway reserves, there's a potential that if they have good years in terms of reserves, we might have additional reserves that we could apply to the project going forward based upon our policies and others. But there are a number of variables. And I think I think the critical thing for the county board to do is to look at comparing the scenarios of bonding versus using the healthcare debt service to pay for this. What is the impact on the taxpayers at the end of the day? Supervisor Lemmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think it is great to try and save that $12 million to go this NCHC route. My concern is there's a projected $213 million deficit in Medicaid, which NCHC would rely on those Medicaid payments. So how does that factor into the schedule of them repaying that debt? I mean, are we looking at a possibility where they may not be able to make that level? And then what would that do? And then just as a side note, the second thing is this seems a little non-transparent to do it this way. I would really hope there would be some very upfront page in the budget book that clearly shows that this is still borrowed money from the taxpayer, so it's not hidden somewhere and appears to be side-handed in some way.
I'll take your North Central Healthcare question. That fear of whether North Central Healthcare can continue to make the payments exists regardless of which scenario you take. And under each scenario, well, under just a factual scenario, it's the way we exist right now. That debt is general obligation debt held by the county. The county has the obligation to service that. Whether you service that through some form of revenue other than debt service levy or debt levy is really the question. You're absolutely right. That was a conversation that the county board had when it issued the debt in the first place for North Central Healthcare. But very well put. We're attempting to be as transparent. I'll just say that's why have the meeting. We need direction from the board on what to go forward. If there's a way that we can say with clarity what the board's, when the board makes a decision to communicate that, we'll certainly do our best to be as transparent. I don't want to take more of Kristen's time, but the next scenarios will just show you kind of it's a different assumption that is underlying the equalized value growth and how that impacts the chart. But don't want to jump ahead if there are more questions, but I appreciate certainly the comment. All right, Kristen, I think you can go to the next slide.
Are you gonna put it up on the screen? Please?
Yep, you should have it.
It's not.
I flipped it to scenario 2. It's the graphical representation of the total new levy for debt service with the blue and gray bars.
Okay, so like, yeah, scenario 2A with the 4% growth, you can see the blue bars are the existing debt service that the county is levying using the revenues to kind of reduce the debt levy. And then you can see the gray area would be the additional amounts that would be levied to keep kind of, and for that discussion point, the mill rate constant, but recognizing that because of the value growth and other variables that are happening, that's not necessarily, you're not keeping the total levy flat. Next slide, just to kind of show scenario 2B is assuming a 5% growth in your equalized value. So in the assumptions box, that equalized value growth 5%, the operating levy annual increase stays the same, the library increase stays the same, that existing mill rate is at 3.4892. But with that increase in value, it takes 2 years to kind of transition to the full debt levy. And just, you know, this chart does show the second to the last column on the right shows total new levy. So you can see that it is increasing, you know, because, you know, it's a multiple. You're dividing it by a higher equalized value to keep that mill rate the same. So you can see that there for the 5% growth. And then kind of, do you want to skip ahead to the 6% growth? Similar, you know, you phase in the full debt service levy with the 6% growth as well. And you also see kind of both the mill rate staying constant or starting to go down as value goes up. But you do see what's happening with that total new levy, which includes debt service as well as your operating levy. And kind of some initial kind of discussion points, and obviously, you know, there's others that are being brought up now, and I think, you know, we can do some further analysis for you. The scenario 1 is if you borrow for the highway building, you know, there's a lower tax impact, but it's spread over 20 years, and that assumes that you don't have any future borrowing needs going forward. And the second bullet point is the estimated interest payments of a 4% interest rate and a 5% interest rate. We actually added the 3% and 6% so you could see what that would look like. And for scenario 2, you can see if you use the North Central Healthcare revenues for the highway building and other capital needs, you have an additional capacity to address deferred maintenance and other projects. The highway project could be financed over a shorter period of time, kind of 5 to 6 years over 20 years. You would avoid paying kind of additional interest on the project. You're already paying interest on existing debt, and you have kind of the ability to manage your levy for debt service. And just kind of thinking out loud on those scenarios, we could draw a line where you reach that 20 million, because then it can become there's that further discussion of if scenario 2 were a viable route for the county board, what's that next discussion?
So if I could just, I'll jump in there. I think that's a great point to Kristen talk about. It's really the start of a conversation, but when you look at, in any of those scenarios, when you're looking at scenario 1, the reason that Kristen is saying it's a lower tax impact, it's because what you're getting is $20 million. You're getting it over 20 years. It's costing you between 29 and 32 million with interest and borrowing costs, but you're only getting the 20 million to put to the project. Under scenario 2, the reason it's any one of those under the way we structured it, we didn't put that line in the sand of, hey, you only need 20 million. You're getting more than $60 million total over that same 20-year period. That's because you're taking that already incurred debt and you're putting it on debt levy and all of the North Central revenue. Again, big assumption there that they're able to get there, but it's that $4.1 million annually. You're having that available to first fund the highway shop, then fund other things that should you determine you need to do them. And I will just say, the idea, if you want an assumption I can guarantee, it's that at some point, Marathon County is going to need to borrow again. I don't know when, but operating under an assumption where you can just fund projects. You funded $26 million of capital projects with American Rescue Plan Act funds. That was a lot of help. I don't expect that some other pot of revenue like that to come up. Just if you look at your 5-year capital plan that was incorporated into your budget, not saying you need to do them all, but you have infrastructure needs. There are a lot of counties in the state of Wisconsin that fund infrastructure needs in terms of roadway and bridge maintenance with borrowing. You generally haven't. You have a radio communication upgrade for our dispatching services in the next several years. It's going to be an expensive project in the neighborhood of $10 million, even on the low end, like if I had to back of the napkin math. Should you determine that you want to stay in the ice arena business, that can be expensive. That's on your 5-year capital plan. You have other building projects. You have a broadband guarantee out for a conduit bond that was issued a number of years ago. That's backed up with general obligation debt. That is debt issuance. So you have all those things. And absent levy limit flexibility to do that, to fund those projects with something other than issuing debt, you have limited options. The good news for Marathon County, and it's very good news, is you have this already issued debt. And it was issued at, as Kristen alluded to, some very advantageous rates, some of them less than 2%. So that's a really good opportunity. There is not a third way, as far as I can tell right now, where someone just is going to give the county, another level of government is going to turn around and just give the county money, whether it's the federal government, the state, or local. So having a long-term capital strategy is certainly helpful. My concern with going down the borrowing route generally, particularly for things like roadway maintenance, is you have roadway maintenance every year. Once you go down the path of saying we're going to borrow for that maintenance in any one given year, it's really hard to get off of that path. And the example I would use for that is the state of Wisconsin. The state of Wisconsin, a number of years ago, quite a number of years ago, began issuing a great deal of debt to fund infrastructure, roadway infrastructure. At a time, and I'm going to get the number wrong, but I'm sure the chair of this committee or the chair of the board can correct me, about a third of every dollar was going to debt service. It's not a great position, or excuse me, to interest. So it's not even going to building anything. That's the good position you're in, is that all the $60 million in scenario 2A through 2C, that's the full amount. You get the actual dollar for dollar amount in that column, as opposed to if you borrow for 20 million, costs you 27 or 29 or 32.
I would perhaps ask, in light of Vice Chair Dickinson's comments, if we could, and I'm very supportive of the approach, look at it from the perspective of the cost to Marathon County as a corporate entity going forward using that, so our internal costs are going to be X. And then if we could also look at it from the perspective of the impact of the mill rate upon an average home in the county with those growth factors, so we could look at it to try to address that concern. I just think that we will have all sorts of opportunities to make decisions in the future relative to how we use that North Central healthcare dollars, whether we use it only for capital or if we use it for capital and levy. But I think that we do have a very, we have soft funding and we budget tighter and tighter and tighter every year. So our ability to carry over reserves for capital projects is more and more limited. So I think that what we have to do is we have to think as stewards of property and prudent investors going forward. And I think that we just need to get as much information out there. And I think that logic will drive the decision, but are there other types of information that the members of the committee would like going forward in order to assist them in making a policy recommendation to the board?
I have something, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, and this is a follow-up for what you were saying earlier, maybe a little expansion of it. And I know we put $30 million away from the highway fund, but is there any way to not just expand that, but look at other reserves without going, under the limits we have set, to move that into the highway shop project? So to try to get that 20 million down. I certainly don't like borrowing, but even NCHC, extending that, if we could, I would rather not do that as well if we can find other, revenue sources sitting around. So looking at a way with the different reserves to try to get that $20 million cost down as well.
I think we've depleted our number one source, which would be the general fund reserves through the loan to Bug Tussle. Which is why we had the problem with the capital improvement. And there are limitations on some of the others, but we certainly could take a look at that where there is opportunities. I'm not sure we're going to generate a lot of opportunity with those funds, but it's certainly worth evaluating. So,
Yeah,
Sam?
We can update the fund balance, that fund balance policy where the last page was kind of the red, yellow and green highlighting to show that information. I think Supervisor Poole, to your point, we can update that to show what is the most updated information we have. And certainly if there are amounts in excess of our existing policies for those reserves, we can bring that back. But you do have a policy, for example, in the social improvement fund. If there is an excess, it already is dealt with through the policy. But we can certainly update those funds to make that very clear. Anything you want to add, Sam?
Just a notation in the fund balance policy that if we do dip below that 25%, it is set to be addressed in the following budget year. So again, just to be cognizant of that.
Kurt?
I think one of the things that, that we, obviously we don't know, is that we've got opportunities on some property and some redevelopment on Thomas Street, on River Drive, potentially the UW campus, and then at some point, potentially, if moved forward, redevelopment on the highway shop, current highway shop facilities. I think those would enter into also our discussion about long-term capital and debt management. But again, those are things that we don't know what the values of those are and what the realization is upon those redevelopments. But I think that to Supervisor Poole's point, I think is what we're potentially looking at, trying to minimize potentially this. But I do, on a general note, like the option of converting potentially some of the NCHC repayment to fund the potential shortfall. Again, looking at there's true costs, and I think we need to understand what those true costs are as far as the debt issuance and the interest that's being paid on those debts. If we're going to convert those to debt levy, what those costs are that we're passing on to the taxpayer in interest in comparison to debt issuance. And that's a significant difference, I think, and we need to understand what that amount means, what that amount is.
Supervisor Hart?
In terms of, thank you, Mr. Chair. In terms of what information we'd like, I think I would like to see what a worst case scenario would be if North Central Healthcare if we couldn't rely on those revenues. I think Supervisor Lemmer brought up a really good point of, those are future challenges, but North Central Healthcare has like ongoing challenges still coming out of the pandemic that I don't know if, I'm very concerned about that scenario. So I would like to see, and I don't want to make any judgments on it, but I feel like we've been presented with, if everything goes well, this is what it's going to look like. But I think we need to also see if things don't go well, I think then, and this is a grand assumption, I think that if things don't go well, then we end up still borrowing and we still might have those overhead costs too. So I would like to see that before we move forward.
We can most certainly present somewhat of a scenario in there. Again, if they were unable to make that debt service payment, we just put it towards the debt levy or supplement it with some other sort of revenue that may be available at the time. When you look at this chart, if we got to maybe year 3 or 4 and they were starting to struggle and maybe they could only make half of that, it still continues to grow that accumulated balance. It's just over an extended period of time. So in the next couple of years, if they're able to make, even 3/4 of it or half of it, we still ultimately end up out better on the strategic front of trying to accomplish a plan like this. I don't know that there's ever going to be I don't know that they're in a financial spot where we don't expect to receive some sort of revenue. It just may not be as much as we have on the original payment plan. But again, if they couldn't make the payments or if it extended them longer, that accumulated balance would just be less. If the concern is, okay, we implement this strategy for the highway building, which I think it's by 2031, that we would have the funding available for it. There again, it's just kind of a loan on the general fund in order to pay it back just internally. And even those accumulated funds, they will still receive interest revenue too. That will be kind of allocated towards it. So it's more than just the dollar value. There should be other revenues that come with that.
If I can say like truly worst case scenario, that's exactly what the chart shows. If North Central couldn't pay a nickel toward debt service in 2027, the county would need to make $7.7 million of debt payment. Absent us finding some other revenue, you would put that on debt levy. All of it. Whatever you can't fund with other revenues is gonna go on debt levy. So what worst case scenario looks like is you the same chart, but then you just aren't able to do any other capital either. That's the worst case scenario. Again, I think Sam is absolutely correct. I don't foresee a world in which North Central can't provide some revenue. Right now, they're at that $2.5 million mark in 2025. Are they able to get to the 4.129 million that is part of the agreement they have with the county to provide? I don't know. I think it's reasonable to assume, even in a bad case scenario, they're somewhere in between. But the true worst case scenario, they can't pay anything on the debt service side. They can operate as they operate now from a business perspective to deliver services, but they can't provide funds for debt service. The county is obligated to pay it. The mechanism you have to pay it if you don't have some other revenues, like sales tax or interest income, you're gonna put it on debt levy. And that's exactly what this chart is. The purpose for the chart, though, is to assume that it's not the worst case scenario and you can use those revenues to fund a highway shop.
Just a little bit more on that, sorry, may I? Just a little bit more on North Central Healthcare. Bear in mind that when we do build the budget, so we just built the 2026 budget based on the revenue that we're anticipating from North Central Healthcare. So there might be a leg in there if there is a inability to pay or a lesser than anticipated amount, just as our current process goes.
Chair Gibbs.
Thank you. As I sit here, I chair the North Central Healthcare Board and the Executive Committee, and we just had a Executive Committee meeting. And I'll tell you, from a financial standpoint, NCHC is in a good position in comparison to where they were, significantly improved. They just also made the debt payment of $2.5 million in December this year, and consistent with the agreement that they have. But they've also set aside reserves to assist them in long-term planning. Is there challenges ahead? No question. Do I have that crystal ball that says they can continue down the financial avenues that they've currently set out upon? No. But I will say, I think that they're in a much better position today than they were literally 5 years ago. And I'm very well encouraged with the management. The challenges, there's many challenges ahead. We will approach them each and every day, but I'm very confident that they will manage within their ability to manage. But you're absolutely correct in that there may be a time that they may not be able to, but that's not at least on the foreseeable vision and the budget that was built for 2026.
Other information that you would like? All right, does that give you the direction that you?
We'll meet after, and if we, as staff, and kind of regroup, we'll try to come up with some taxpayer impact pieces and more conversations to come. Again, what I would envision if this is a strategy you would prefer is to move in an option, one of the options under section 2 is really more conversation during the budget planning process and during the highway construction processes. how are we gonna pay for it? And you can always change that. If we have like I said, if equalized value is 8% again, it doesn't mean you need to be stuck on taking and putting 3.2 million onto debt levy in one hit. I think incremental approach is good because people's tax bill, as the vice chair referenced, that's what they look at. They don't look at necessarily the mill rate. Some do, but far more people look at the actual dollars. If you put all of it on at once, it's a big dollar increase. The idea, if you do it incrementally, it's still a dollar increase, but it's less.
We will look forward to additional discussion. I think the consensus is that we should explore the scenario 2 model with that information, but from a comparative analysis, we'll need to look at it and compare it to scenario 1 for the county board to understand it. So is that a fair assessment? All right. We will move on then to the 2006 comprehensive plan draft. Is that you or Lori?
Lori's on. She can take, I think everybody's probably seen this because you've all are actually on other committees as well.
Yeah, I do apologize. I forgot to send the attachments to this committee's packet folder as well, but within your agenda, there is a link to the comprehensive plan page. A full draft of the comprehensive plan is now available for review. At that link, the executive committee has asked us to put it back out to the standing committees and get any additional comments by February 11th so that they can consider any changes before making a resolution to put it out there for adoption and starting that 30-day review period for prior to a public hearing that would then bring it back to the executive committee and the county board in March for adoption. In the document on page 242.
Lori, if I could just interject that if you go to the Public Safety Committee agenda in the packet, there is the summary of the points. So if you wanted to just jump into that packet from their meeting yesterday, you would get the high level recommendations on each of the chapters. So I'm sorry for interrupting, but.
Yeah, so I can definitely send over the document that has the summary of all the goals and objectives by chapter. If you go to 242 of the comprehensive plan as well, you'll start to see the goals and objectives by chapter as well as the actions associated with those goals and objectives. So the executive committee is asking people to definitely spend some time reviewing those goals and objectives and ensuring those are the ones we want in our comprehensive plan, as those are what drives our next strategic plan. I think the other thing that's been discussed at other committees is just making that the objectives are meant to be broad for sure, to make sure that they cover the scope of things the county board may want to work on. So definitely check out chapter 13 of the comprehensive plan, because in some cases there may be a strategy or action that's a little bit more specific. If you think an objective is missing, it might just be captured in that strategy or action item in chapter 13 instead. So Administrator Leonard, did you want to add anything else?
Just to give the example, I think Lori, you gave this example at some of the other meetings on that. The idea that the objectives are broad and strategies might be helpful to illustrate this point. There was a discussion at Health and Human Services about, well, shouldn't we have an objective that really targets homelessness? And you can add an objective if you want. This is a refresh of the comprehensive plan. We're really operating off of the objectives as they were approved in 2016. And the discussion at Health and Human Services was, well, there's not a very clear reference in any of the objectives of homelessness or the unhoused population. There is an objective that gets at addressing housing needs. And then underneath that objective, there is a strategy from within the comp plan that does expressly mention addressing homelessness. So it might be helpful if you think, oh, geez, something's not we need to say something more clearly, it's not mentioned, and you certainly can still do that even with homelessness. It might be helpful to, if you have that inclination of, well, geez, we're not mentioning topic X, take a look at the strategies as well, it might already be there.
All right, I think in light of the hour, today we'll put this on our agenda for our next meeting for continued discussion. If you could take a good look at the document, and particularly the summary pages, and we can determine it. But there's chapter 12 dealing with intergovernmental cooperation. Really, a number of those areas fall within the purview of this committee. And historically, and the strategic plan, the role of the Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee has been one more of support versus leadership in many of the objectives in the plan. But we clearly, many of those impact the budget, which falls within our purview. And I would just encourage you to take a look at it and see if we've covered things going forward for the next 10, 15 years. And as Administrator Leonard said, if you would like to see additional items put in there or have a concern over something in there, bring those up and we can talk about that at the next meeting. Does that make sense? All right. Anything else under the comprehensive plan? Any questions? All right. If not, that would take us to item 8. Committee members are asked to bring ideas for future discussion. I think we continue to have full agendas for the going forward. But if you have specific items, I know health insurance updates and where we are will be one. We'll have a number of other items coming forward in the near future. So our next meeting is Tuesday, January 27th. And we will have at some point in time additional follow-up meetings relative to the university and others. So keep that in mind. And then that'll take us to item 9. Moved by Chair Gibbs, seconded by Supervisor Lemmer to adjourn. All those in favor of adjournment will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no.